I find it hard to imagine, a worse situation than the one that the Ukrainians are in today, where they've been fighting this valiant war, where many people, after the Russians initially invaded, many people said, well, this will be over quickly, and the Ukrainians won't be able to defend themselves, and they've proven that absolutely wrong. And now are finding that they've got to fight on this, second front in the United States Congress. And normally, if you're talking about the Congress, you sort of say, well, it's a body in which you've got to work very hard to get agreement to move forward. It's unusual to have one individual holding the fate of something as important as Ukraine in his hands, but Mike Johnson does today. He could, put the Ukraine aid bill that's already passed the Senate. He could put that on the floor. He should have called the House back into session. They're coming back this week. He ought to put it on the floor for a vote immediately.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and dedicated to the proposition first articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the necessary shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. I'm joined, as always, by my colleague in this enterprise, Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and the Arleigh Burke Chair of Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Eliot, great to see you.
Great to see you. And I have to tell you, I'm particularly impressed, Eric, that in a fantastic book that I've just read, you are referred to quite prominently on page 15 as a tremendously skilled and effective career ambassador who had served presidents of both parties at the highest levels of government. And I have to add, that's all the more...
It goes on.
No, it does go on at great length, but I don't want to blow up his ego even more than it is. Now, I have to explain to our listeners that the thing that's so striking is that this comes from a book which is really a study in herpetology. For those of you who know what herpetology is, it's the study of snakes.
Well,
I think I'll leave it
with
there.
That,
over to you, Eric.
I want to introduce our very special guest, Liz Cheney, former representative from Wyoming, Republican from Wyoming, and a star of the January 6th committee and a friend of both Eliot's and mine, and a great American public servant. Her book, Oath and Honor, is a New York Times bestseller. If you don't have a copy, you absolutely must buy one and read it. It is a fantastic book, incredible memoir, but also, as the subtitle says, a warning for where our country might be headed in the next electoral cycle. Liz, welcome to Shield of the Republic. It's great to have you.
Well, it's an honor to be with you, and great to have the chance to talk to both you and to Eliot. So thank you guys very much for having me on, and thanks for everything you both have done over so many years for the Republic.
So, Liz, it's been a year, a little bit more, since the January 6th committee finished up its hearings. You guys reported out. You did a report. You've now written a terrific book about the entire process of the election, your experience dealing with the election, the big lie, and then the effort to expose it in the committee. As you've been doing your book tour, as you've been speaking around the country, what's your assessment 1 year on of the impact that the committee had on American public discourse, on how people think about the events of January 6th? There was a lot of speculation before the committee that it would be a dud, that nobody cared. That didn't turn out to be the way it was. It was incredibly compelling television, having watched all the hearings. And from my point of view, very well done. But what's your assessment of kind of what the impact has been?
Well, thank you for that. And I think that when I look at the work that the committee did, the first sort of lens through which I think you have to assess it is the extent to which there were people who were opposed to even having an investigation at all, even opposed to the original bipartisan commission that would seem to have been the obvious thing that we would do, what we do after every sort of major crisis in modern history in this country. And the fact that that was voted down, and that then we formed the select committee. So first of all, I would say I couldn't have conceived of moving forward without an investigation. And I think it's crucially important that that we were able both to secure the testimony of so many of the witnesses who did appear before the committee, and reminding people that the vast majority of the witnesses who testified were Republicans. And it certainly made clear, in my view, going in, that what Donald Trump was engaged in was much broader, much deeper, much more sort of a widespread plan, a multi-part plan to attempt to overturn the election and seize power. And I think, had we not conducted an investigation, certainly there are many parts of what he did that likely would have been lost to history. I think that prior to the investigation getting underway, the Justice Department had certainly done a huge amount of work in terms of prosecutions of the people who were actually in the Capitol. I think that it was, at least in part because of the work of the committee and the information that we were able to gather, and the way that we were able to publicly put it on, that the Justice Department began to move, just as aggressively to make sure that people were held accountable, not just the sort of the foot soldiers, if you will, but all the way up to the president himself. And I think that's been important. I think certainly, we know that because of public reporting, that the Justice Department, the special counsel, has been able to get testimony from some of the witnesses who would not testify in front of the committee. I think that's been important. I also think that if you look at the efforts that Donald Trump has got underway now to attempt to delay the January 6th trial, he's also now attempting, we know, to delay the documents trial. But he knows, partly because of the public testimony in front of our committee, partly because Donald Trump's got access to the grand jury testimony. He knows the witnesses who will testify against him in open court, and he knows what they will say if the January 6th trial goes forward. And so he's doing everything he can to try to stop that. I think it's hugely important, and I suspect that the Supreme Court understands how important it is that evidence not be suppressed, that the American people get a chance to see that all before we go to the polls again. And that they're well aware that actually, the election interference that's going on here is Donald Trump trying to prevent the American people from hearing that testimony. So I'm very proud of what the committee accomplished. I'm proud of the way in which we did our work, and I think it was hugely important for history that people understand the unprecedented nature of the threat that Donald Trump poses.
I think we should probably tell our listeners that it really is a terrific memoir. It's an account of the inquiry, but it's also very much an account of the day and of the behavior of particularly various of your colleagues in ways that really are appalling. And that's why, I referred to it as a work in herpetology. Do you think within the Republican Party, and particularly among political leadership, that it's had any impact on them whatsoever? Because it is, I think I can speak for all of us. It's very distressing when you look at the behavior of the so-called leaders of the Republican Party, how most of them just clearly want to pretend this didn't happen, or just say, well, January 6th was a kind of a demonstration that got out of hand or something like that. Do you see any lasting effect from that, or are they simply impervious?
Well, what it looks like to me is that you have a situation where right after January 6th, we were nearly unanimous in the days just after the 6th. Republicans nearly unanimous in recognizing that a line had been crossed that could never be crossed, and that Donald Trump was responsible. And if you look at the public statements of most of the leaders at the time, that's what they were saying. I think that what you've seen since then is really cowardice, and um, they know the truth, but the human capacity for rationalization has been on full display, and I think that when historians look back, they will identify several factors here. I mean, one, you have very small number of people who actually believe what Trump is saying. Very small number of elected Republicans in the Congress. Like, you can count them on one hand. um, but then a much larger number who began to decide for a variety of reasons, whether it was their own political survival or fears of safety, which were legitimate concerns about safety and the threats coming from the former president. Um, just because of for convenience sake. In many instances, I had individuals, including Senator McConnell, on a number of occasions, tell me that he fully understood the danger that Donald Trump posed. His public remarks reflect that, um, but say that we just need to ignore him. That if we just ignore him, he'll go away. And I think a lot of elected officials comforted themselves. And we were able to sort of say, well, we're not going to stand up against this because it'll go away if we don't. Um, and what that did was it really gave space for voters, Republican voters across the country, to say, well, wait, if our leaders are not speaking out against this, then it must not be so bad. And so I'm very disappointed. And certainly as somebody who grew up in Republican politics and has known many of these people for decades, I really did believe that if it ever came to it, when the chips were down, the people would do the right thing. And certainly that's not what we're seeing. But I do think that those people who are enabling this are themselves just as accountable, as the former president, because he can't succeed without them. Um, but the last thing I'll say on this is that is a description of what's happening within the Republican Party. It's not a description of what's happening within the electorate as a whole. And I think that's where, when you see over 30% of Republicans in New Hampshire, for example, saying they'll never vote for Donald Trump, there are real warning signs, and they're hopeful signs for those of us who believe in the Constitution, frankly, that ultimately the general electorate will get this right, will not reelect Donald Trump.
So if I could just press a little bit on that. I mean, in some ways, I find for myself, Trump is what he is, despicable character. I don't know how many times I've said that, and so it's not actually even very interesting. And he's just awful. I find alarming the lack of some kind of backbone, some kind of principled behavior on the part of most Republicans. I mean, most Republican leaders, I should say. There are the noble counterexamples. You and Adam Kinzinger and the people who voted for impeachment and a few others. But there are a tiny minority, let's face it, and people who I had thought much better of, like Lindsey Graham, for example, have really bent the knee. And what worries me about this is, quite apart from the possibility of Trump becoming president again, which would be a disaster in so many ways for the country, how will the United States be able to exercise leadership when you have the leadership of one of the two great parties being this craven? And of course, we're really seeing this on the Ukraine vote, which is, this is absolutely critical for the survival of Ukraine. And we all know what's happening with that. I mean, I hope they can pull it out at the last minute, but That's my biggest concern. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, you know, when I say that the people who are enabling him have to be held accountable too, I think that it certainly includes the, people like Lindsey Graham, people like Tim Scott, um, people who absolutely know um, the extent to which both the danger that Trump poses at home, but also what uh, Trump's embrace of an admiration for um, strongmen. They know what that means for the United States, and what it means for the cause of freedom globally. And I I find it hard to imagine, a worse situation than the one that the Ukrainians are in today, where they've been fighting this valiant war, where many people, after the Russians initially invaded, many people said, well, this will be over quickly, and the Ukrainians won't be able to defend themselves, and they've proven that absolutely wrong. And now are finding that they've got to fight on this second front in the United States Congress. And normally, if you're talking about the Congress, you sort of say, well, it's a body in which you've got to work very hard to get agreement to move forward. It's unusual to have one individual holding the fate of something as important as Ukraine in his hands, but Mike Johnson does today. He could, put the Ukraine aid bill that's already passed the Senate. He could put that on the floor. He should have called the House back into session. They're coming back this week. He ought to put it on the floor for a vote immediately. And I think that, again, this is a place where when you think about what comes after 2024, I think the party itself is going to have to. I don't know if it can survive, but conservatives and those of us who believe strongly in American leadership in the world are going to have to be very clear and honest about what's at stake, and about the credibility of people that have abandoned this cause for political expedience, over the last several months here.
Well, Liz, you know Mike Johnson pretty well. He was your deputy, I guess, when you were chairing the Republican House Conference. You discuss his role. It was not a particularly felicitous role after the election in dealing with the various lawsuits, the big lie, the amicus brief that many members signed on to for the Texas case, et cetera. What do you think is motivating him here? I mean, is it fear of the Freedom Caucus, and a motion to vacate? Is it fear of Donald Trump? He has said publicly he supports Ukraine and, supports aid to Ukraine, yet he's not doing anything, as you point out, to actually get the majority, because everybody agrees there's a bipartisan, bicameral majority to support the bill. But he's not doing anything to bring it to a vote. What is the explanation for that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I think it's he fears that the Freedom Caucus will bring a motion to vacate, and but my advice to him, which I'm not suggesting that he's listening to my advice, but my advice to him would be, what, it's worth it. If history looks back on you and says, at this moment, you met your moment and you did what was right to save lives and defeat the Russians in Ukraine and ensure the Americans that we don't have to deploy our own men and women to fight when Putin moves next into a NATO country. If they move to vacate the chair, it's worth it. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right in a very difficult set of circumstances. So he clearly fears that. He also fears Donald Trump. One of the real sort of challenges of dealing with Mike Johnson after the election of 2020 that I write about in the book was he was so clearly not what I thought he was. And so we would have discussions about the legal arguments he was making. And I would say to him and others, Kevin McCarthy's counsel was saying to him, Mike, there's no basis for what you're arguing in the law. There's no basis for it in the Constitution. You're wrong on the legal theory. And he would often acknowledge in those conversations that he knew he was wrong. But then the very next time he was speaking a meeting of the House Republicans, he would still, be taking the position that he knew to be wrong. So I think that it's not a surprise that he would be conducting himself the way he is, given what we know he did previously. But again, I think that people ought to really take a step back and think about what some things have to matter here, and whether or not America helps Ukrainians defeat Putin. Whether or not America stands on the side of freedom, that really matters. And our members ought to be conducting themselves that way. I think it also is really important as people look at this question of Donald Trump and a second term, the notion that somehow he will not present that grave of a threat because of the checks and balances, that's obviously false if you look at the fact that Congress won't even right now, the Republicans won't stand up to him, and he's not even the nominee of the party formally. And so the idea that, well, we don't have to worry about his authoritarian tendencies in a second term because we have Congress, it's completely false.
So here's my question for you as you're a student of history as well as having been a diplomat, a lawyer, on top of all of it. How did Trump get this hold over people? I mean, I think I sometimes, as I try to think through this period, try to imagine what are the things that graduate students in history will be baffled about 50 years from now, scratching their heads and saying, Professor so-and-so, how on earth did that happen? But what is your explanation?
Well, I think that one of the things that he's done is tap into a very real sense that millions of Americans have had, that their government doesn't listen to them. And he of course betrays them, and he lies to them and has convinced them that somehow he's the solution. But it's a real thing. I mean, I often think about the people that I represented in Wyoming, and if you are trying to graze cattle, your livelihood depends upon grazing cattle on public lands. And you've got, a bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. issuing regulations that could destroy your livelihood, and nobody will listen to you. You can't find a way in. And suddenly you've got, Donald Trump appears and says, I'll be your voice. Millions of people have believed him. And so I think that it's important to recognize that there's something very real that he's tapped into. Now, I think that you also have elements that we've seen in other societies around the world of the effectiveness of this big lie. I think that what he's trying to do is also clearly been fomented by foreign adversaries. The kind of divisiveness and conspiracy theories, the kind of attack on democracy that Donald Trump is leading is exactly what the Russians and the Chinese would like the world to think about our democracy. But he also is the first American president, I think, who just does not have a reverence for, doesn't understand, doesn't know about, but doesn't have a fundamental reverence for our founding principles, for our founding documents. And I suppose, if you look back at what the framers said about the kinds of people they knew we would have to protect against, they pretty accurately described Donald Trump in a number of instances. So they understood the threat. And I think you could say, part of what's surprising is we haven't faced the threat earlier. We made it this many years without having to deal with many of the challenges they thought that we would. But he's a particularly dangerous leader, partly because I think that there are a lot of people who have discounted him. And I think that's dangerous. And then I would come back to the notion that we were talking about before of the enablers, because everything that I've said, he can't do any of it effectively if you don't have formerly responsible Republicans helping him. And, had everybody maintained the position that we had right after the attack on January 6th, had the Senate convicted him, had people done their duty, then we wouldn't be facing the threat we're facing today.
This is a kind of personal question, but you and I first met some 30 years ago when we were working, together to bring down the Soviet system and then to replace it with a democratic system. You worked, on the transition to democracy in the early 90s in the Bush 41 administration. You worked with Boris Nemtsov, the late Boris Nemtsov. I'm just wondering whether you had the same, almost physical revulsion that I did the other day when Laura Ingraham was interviewing, Donald Trump and asking him about his various legal difficulties. He said, "Oh, this is all a kind of Navalny. I'm being treated like Navalny. I'm a dissident," in which he actually said at the CPAC meeting, where he said he was a dissident. I mean, I found this almost, physically nauseating to hear him say this, and I just was curious whether you had a similar reaction.
Yeah, I mean, both to that, as well as to, the fact that he hasn't condemned Putin for Navalny's killing, the and the extent to which, you've got others, you guys have mentioned some of them, other Republicans who used to be leaders in the national security area who similarly refused to condemn Putin. And I think that the danger, this, it sort of goes to the danger of a second term, partly because if you think about the alliances that you both are far more expert in this than I am, but the alliances that have kept us safe for so many years, the intelligence sharing that's kept us safe for so many years, the Five Eyes relationships, the extent to which we've been able to work with these countries because they trusted us. And if you think about, one of the threats of a Trump second term that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage is, what does it mean to have Donald Trump in charge of the intelligence apparatus of the United States? And knowing that he will appoint people like Kash Patel, like General Mike Flynn, and then asking yourself, well, is that really going to call into question our allies and the extent to which they think they can trust us? They think, will they be able to trust the American president with the kind of intelligence sharing that we've needed to defend the nation for so many years? And it's a really perilous question. But certainly the idea that America, which has so clearly stood on the side of freedom, suddenly, we're going to be faced with the nominee potentially of one of our two parties who would rather line up with strongmen, and he really doesn't try to hide that. He talked about Russia's tremendous war machine, and I can't count now the number of times he's praised President Xi of China. But it's a kind of even more, frankly, than the moral equivalence that I know we all used to find so dishonest, frankly, when the left would do it during the Cold War. But this is even beyond that. This is, these strongmen are better. They're better than America. They're better than us. That's Donald Trump's perspective.
Well, I think that leads me to there's a logical question. I think of that Tucker Carlson interview with Putin, which was obsequious, and his subsequent filming of himself in Moscow. It is really truckling to these people. Eric mentioned CPAC, and we were talking a bit before the show about some of the characters who've gone onto the stage there, genuine dictators, people who are kind of fascistic, or you have sort of extreme religious movements which want to basically overturn the separation of church and state, which has been critical, I think, to the Republic as well. And, the question that I have in all this is to what extent are we simply seeing kind of the bubbling to the top of currents that were always there. You know, I started off very early on writing for National Review for the late Bill Buckley, who, very much to his credit, even though he came from a background of isolationism, a certain amount of racism and anti-Semitism, you know, evolved way past that, transcended it, and actually helped, you know, drive some of those folks underground, the Birchers and so on, and even people who've been close friends of his, like Joe Sobran. Is that what's going on now? That this stuff is, you know, it's resurfacing like the cicadas, you know, they go underground for 17 years and then they come to the surface and breed? Or is there, do you think, and here I'm, you know, really turn to your political judgment, something kind of deeper at work in the country that we should take cognizance of and reflect on?
You know, I think that there are several things that are at work. I mean, if again, you know, if you look at for example, the you know, people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, um, many of them, you know, carried with them the signs of racism, the signs of anti-Semitism. Um, you know, we saw a Confederate flag inside the Capitol, and Holocaust denial, T-shirts, and other indicia of kind of racism and anti-Semitism. And certainly there, if you look at the difference in the way that the House Republican leadership dealt, for example, with Steve King in early 2019, I believe, you know, as soon as it became clear that Steve King, representative from Iowa, had made comments that, you know, embraced the idea of white nationalism, white supremacy, uh, you know, we immediately condemned him and immediately removed him from his committees. There was no question. And if you compare that to, you know, what has been going on now in the Republican conference in the last couple of years, the people with those views, you know, people like Paul Gosar, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene, they've been elevated. So, you know, that is also, you know, I think something people need to focus on in terms of an indication of kind of where the Republicans are. I think that you know, Donald Trump certainly brought views that were in many ways, you know, operating in the dark. He made it acceptable on some level, and people began to say things publicly. I mean, when you have, you know, Donald Trump dining at Mar-a-Lago with Nick Fuentes, who is a despicable and disgusting white supremacist, Holocaust denier, you know, openly dining with him, and people sort of write that off. There's absolutely, I mean, if you just look at Trump's comments during the debates in 2020 when he told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by instead of condemning them, you know, so he himself has fomented this. But look, I think you also, if you look at what's happened across the country since October 7th, if you look at the rise in anti-Semitism on college campuses, the extent to which you've got, you know, actual Hamas sympathizers, you know, the chanting from the river to the sea and chanting for genocide. You know, that is also something that, and we're seeing that around the world, not just in the United States. It's in some ways that's a resurgent of some of the things we've seen before, a resurgence of it. Now, the anti-Semitism is not only on the right. You know, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar got members of Congress, and you know, the Democrats would not condemn Ilhan Omar when she made very clearly anti-Semitic remarks several years ago. But I think the extent to which the Republican Party had a moment where we could have chosen, and we, you know, obviously I should have chosen to turn away from this, and didn't. I think, you know, that sends a very clear signal to people that believe these things that, you know, your home is in the Republican Party, unfortunately.
Liz, I'd like to go back to something Eliot talked about earlier, which is the question of how the United States behaves in the world when its main adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are all governed by authoritarian regimes. And one great party, a party that was, founded on reverence for freedom and liberty, actually, both economic and social, um, is and political equality, is headed by a would-be authoritarian who, as you've said, a couple of times already on this, just on this show, you know, lavishes praise on Putin and Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong Un. I mean, his famous love letters with Kim Jong Un. I mean, what do you think the impact is on the ability of the United States to actually lead in a world kind of beset by authoritarians, revanchists, people pursuing territorial aggression, um, when we have this problem at home?
Well, I mean, look, I think this is an issue I know you both have done a huge amount of work on, years of work on, and I think first of all, it's why we have to defeat Donald Trump. Um, but secondly, I would say, the we don't have right now advocates in either party, unfortunately, for the kind of strong American leadership in the world that we need. And while my own view is obviously that Donald Trump presents the existential threat, if you look at the approach to national security policy that the Biden administration has taken, in too many instances, they've made very serious misjudgments. Whether it's lifting the sanctions on Iran or failing to have the kind of muscular response that we should have had when American shipping and all shipping came under attack from the Houthis, Iranian-backed Houthis. Whether the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the way that it was done, and in my view, the fact that it was done, certainly is sending a message where you can imagine America's allies around the world begin to think, well, we ought to maybe make other arrangements if we can't count on the United States. And I think that we have, because we've been faced with so many challenges domestically, we have not had the kinds of debates that we need to be having about national security policy. And you see things like the budget cuts that the Defense Department announced, I don't know, last week, just a few days ago, and those deserve, those ought to be the center of attention. And the extent to which our adversaries are building up and developing capabilities that we can't counter, that we don't have in some instances, and we're cutting our defense budget. And I think that it's another reason why, in my view, once we get past 2024, we really either have to develop a new party or completely reform the Republican Party, because it isn't, as we've talked about, Trump's embrace of the dictators and the authoritarians would have been unimaginable a few years ago, pre-Trump. But you also have this spreading view within the Republican Party, people that are, again, advocating isolationism and seem not to understand history or understand the importance of America's role in the world. And that's got to be defeated as well. Ultimately, we need more strategic thinkers in high office, both appointed and elected. And we need to understand and recognize the gravity of the situation we're facing globally, as well as here at home.
Could I pursue that a little bit further? Obviously, if God forbid Trump is elected, then we've got in some ways, an existential set of issues on the table. My own feeling has been that's probably not going to happen. I mean, even if you look at the recent primary in South Carolina, I'm not sure that's all such good news for Trump. We can talk about that, but let's go to exactly the point you raised. I mean, I have to tell you, when people ask me whether I'm still a Republican, I say no. That's because I'm a conservative. Could you talk about those two possible paths and what they would look like? A recovery of the Republican Party to something that would be more like the party of Reagan and the Bushes, or would I will tell you, I don't have a whole lot of confidence in that. I really don't. I find it very doubtful. And I will confess, I was very glad to hear you raise the possibility of another party, because I think this may be one of those crisis points in the history of the Republic where you need to do things that, people in normal times would find it, inconceivable or impossible or just too painful to conceive of. So could you talk through that, particularly the idea of a third party?
Yeah, I think that it partly will be governed by what happens in November of this year, and I'm with you in terms of I think that Trump has to be beaten, and I think that Trump can be beaten, and I think it's really important for the Democrats to operate in a way that doesn't drive independents to Trump. I mean, I think there are a lot of pieces to that policy, but I think a loss in November certainly will inform what the next steps are. Um, if you look at the Republican Party today, one of the really significant challenges we have is the extent to which positions of leadership in the party, all up and down, but starting in too many cases from the precinct committee men and women, up to the state party chairs, have been taken over by people who have embraced Trump. I mean, in Wyoming, the chairman of our party is a member of the Oath Keepers. And so you have that phenomenon that's taken hold, which each day that goes by, again, I share your concerns, Eliot, that it becomes harder and harder to imagine that the party itself can survive. I think that what will have to happen, once Trump gets the nomination, if that is what happens, seems to be the path that we're on, and then following through into November, I think you're going to have, in many ways, and we need to help encourage this, in my view, a splintering of the party and a recognition that the people that are staying in the party, if the party stays structured the way it is and looks like it does now, that those people, there's an embrace of what we've seen happen over the last 3 years that is, in my view, very hard to come back from. But that there are far more people around the country who want responsible leadership, who don't want the extremes on either side that we're seeing now, who want seriousness in dealing with the issues that we're facing, and that begins to look more and more like a third party. And the questions that a third party faces during an election cycle, where you're very consumed with, can you get on the ballot in this cycle, and what does that look like? In some ways, those are questions that a party needs to be addressing and dealing with once it's had time to become established, and they're much more difficult to deal with now in the heat of this election cycle. But going through the process that we haven't been through since the Civil War, really, in terms of forming a legitimate, whether this would be a third party, whether it would be a conservative party that takes enough support away from the Republican Party that, the Republicans become the Whigs. I don't know how that all pans out, but I think there's a combination of sort of the substantive movement that has to be built, as well as the mechanics of, party conventions and, establishing a platform and all of those things that define a party. But there are enough people that are dissatisfied, and not even just dissatisfied, but deeply concerned about what's happened to the Republican Party. That I think that we're going to be at a moment where one of those two things has to happen, and even though we know politics can move very quickly, things can change very fast. I find it harder and harder to see the current Republican Party being able to come back from where it is today, in anything that looks like the near future, and time enough for us to have the debates we have to have before we get to the next presidential election.
I wonder if I could get you to talk a bit about the importance of a rule of law. This is something that's a major theme, of course, in the book, and it's something that, at least for me, is emerged as a major theme in my own work as a diplomat dealing with other countries. That you can talk about elections and reforms, but if there's not fundamental respect for rule of law, it's very difficult for democracy to take root, to thrive, and to survive. You and your husband, Phil Perry, wrote a long, detailed memo for your colleagues back in December of 2020, outlining all the cases that Donald Trump and the campaign had brought about electoral fraud. And I think they won 1 out of 61, and I think that was a very kind of narrow technical ruling. But 60 of them found that there was no major fraud, and yet so many of your colleagues, as you detailed in the book and as you've commented here, in the end of the day, were willing to let rule of law sort of go by the boards. I mean, again, I'm still trying to explain that, to myself, to understand it. And I understand, in Washington, everybody is ambitious, whether you're a bureaucrat or an elected official. There's a certain amount of ambition that draws people to Washington. But as you said earlier, at some point, sort of fundamental things have to matter. It can't all just be about personal ambition. What's your reflection on all of that from this experience?
Well, I think it's perhaps sort of the area as we look at the danger of a second term that people really do need to focus on. I mean, we talked about sort of the extent to which Congress is not going to provide any sort of a check and balance against a second Trump term, and so then I think you have to look to the courts, and the thing that people, I think, don't fully understand or maybe focus on is that the rulings of our courts only have power if the chief executive enforces them. And the quickest way to begin to unravel the foundations of the republic would be a Donald Trump who has told us this is what he will do, who decides that actually the rulings of the Supreme Court don't apply to him, who asserts, as his lawyers have, that he as president has the ability to ignore those rulings to make his own constitutional interpretations. Obviously, he's claiming he's got complete immunity, but I remind people that those folks who said, well, he couldn't have actually stayed in power after January 20th because the Supreme Court would have gotten involved, the court would have ruled, and I asked people to think, look, maybe they would have gotten involved, but who's going to enforce that ruling? Let's say they did, issue a ruling that he had to leave office. Who enforces that? And I think that recognizing, if you look at what he's doing today, and the attacks on the judiciary, the attacks on the court system, the threats of violence, the fact that jurors sitting in his criminal trials and his civil trials now, have had to have their identities protected. They're anonymous, and the judge, has warned in the E. Jean Carroll case, ordered that the jurors not reveal who else was on those juries. Those are the kinds of things that normally would happen if you were dealing with a mob trial, but this is Donald Trump, and I think that it's a crucial point. As you said, people think about elections, which obviously fundamentally important for a functioning democracy, but what it means to live under the rule of law, and the extent to which that is threatened, is a hugely important part of this. It also goes to education. I mean, we have really fallen far back in terms of our ability to educate young people adequately about what the Constitution says and how it works, and what the rule of law is and what it means, and we have to do a much better job of that going forward as well.
I'll just say, as a erstwhile school teacher, I think that's 100% correct. I mean, it it is appalling how little American history is taught, and sort of basic civics, but also, a kind of history which would make you think that this system is admirable and it's worth being vigilant and defending it. I'm seeing we're unfortunately we're going to be coming to the end of our time. The question I wanted to ask you is a way to get back to the book. And there are plenty of villains there, and like I said, a number of snakes and reptiles and so forth. But there are also some quite heroic figures, and I think everybody's now familiar with some of the the police officers and others who really put themselves in harm's way, and obviously that is genuine heroism. But I think some of your colleagues behaved that way, and I have to say I found very touching some of the across the aisle kinds of moments. I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the human relations side of that experience, both on the day and in the subsequent investigation, and what are the ones that really stick with you?
Yeah, it's such an important point. I mean, it's an important point because it gives me real hope. And it also, I think, shows people that there are brave and courageous Americans out there, many of them Republicans, who did their duty and who stood up against the tremendous pressure, to capitulate and to help Donald Trump steal the election. And so I was inspired by so many of those examples. People like Rusty Bowers, who was the Speaker of the Arizona State House, and at a moment of real personal crisis for him, his daughter had a terminal illness, and she was dying while the Trump people were calling him a pedophile and threatening him. I mean, it was a really disgusting story, and Rusty stood up in ways that were very brave and powerful, as did a number of others. The Capitol Police, you mentioned, the Metropolitan Police officers, and the the members of Congress that I think about, people like Abigail Spanberger, for example, a Democrat. We disagree on a number of issues, I'm sure, but Abigail, she said to me at one point that she had trained as a CIA officer, how she would defend herself if she found herself in a building under attack, but she never imagined she would have to use those skills in the chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives while the Capitol was being attacked. People like Mikey Sherrill, Mikey and I have had several important conversations. Mikey's another, she's a Democrat from New Jersey, about this issue of civics and education and what can be done across party lines to help improve the teaching of American history in our classrooms. I also think, I certainly hope it's the case that on both sides of the aisle, there's been sort of a recognition that, you can't say everything is a 5-alarm fire, because then when you really do face a 5-alarm fire like we are now, it becomes harder to convince people that what you're saying is actually, this threat really is that big. And I hope that will change the way that we all talk to each other, that we all talk about our political opponents, and I think voters have a huge potential to have a huge impact there in terms of who they vote for, who they support, and rewarding people who are doing serious work, and not just sort of launching partisan attacks for social media likes.
Liz, we are coming to the end of our time. I mean, I think Eliot and I could, continue this conversation with you for, hours on end. But we won't do that to you.
Well, I would look forward to it. We could do it over a meal.
That sounds like a plan. But our guest has been Representative Liz Cheney, author of Oath and Honor. If you don't have a copy, please go get one. She's a national treasure, and we're very grateful that you've spent this hour with us on Shield of the Republic, and hope we can have you back in the future.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I look forward to it, and I'm learning all kinds of new vocabulary words about snakes. So I appreciate that.